Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Basil Cusack-Decoe. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at the American University of the Middle East. Today, I'll be talking about language and power and the way in which language and power are interrelated within Japanese society and across many parts of the Japanese language. So, we're going to focus on a couple of questions with each other in this guest lecture. The first of which is standardization. What motivated different groups and individuals within Japanese society and beyond to standardize Japanese, both in its written and spoken forms? Another question is, were there any significant differences between spoken and written Japanese in the first place? Was there a need to actually standardize and, I guess, in a sense, unify written and spoken Japanese? I guess the sub-question here would be, was Japanese widely recognized as a language in its own right? And then the third question is, when did real efforts to standardize Japanese actually begin? We'll answer that question and try to think about how policymaking has tried to shape and reshape the way in which Japanese is both spoken and written as a language. But let's begin in the late Edo period, when Japan really started modernizing. The idea of the nation was born, and in the mid to late 1800s, people really began thinking quite carefully about the role that language was going to play within a newly modernizing Japan. It's in this context of modernization that we need to think about written Japanese to start off with, and the different forms of written Japanese that existed. There were three main forms of written Japanese in circulation within Japanese society during the late Edo period. We had the language of the masses, which was relatively simplistic and accessible. Examples of this include popular fiction and manuals and treatises on a variety of different subjects, agricultural and otherwise. We have the language of scholars, which was complex and required further education. Here, I'm thinking predominantly of Buddhist and Shinto texts. In order to read these texts, you needed an understanding of a different form of written Japanese. Not just the vocabulary, but the actual written form itself was relatively different, very different, some would argue, to the language of the masses. And then we have, of course, the language of the elite, which in a sense can be described as overly complex, erudite, and this required a background in various different, bodies of literature, such as the Sino-Japanese classics, Chinese poetry. These things, of course, meant that people who wanted to speak the language and read the language of the elite needed to have enough resources to invest in their own education. Now, we have an example here of popular fiction. Here's a written text. This was in circulation in the early 1800s, but it was so popular that people continued to read it well beyond the date of its publication. This is Shank's Mare by Jipensha Ikku. Okay, so this is published in a serial format. Many of these published during the early 1800s, and people were reading Shank's Mare throughout the 19th century. Here's an example of a Buddhist text. These are religious texts from the late Edo period. As you can see here, Chinese characters of kanji can be found throughout. Okay. And this required special training in order to understand. We have elite literature, so classical Chinese poetry. Some examples of compositions here from Ichikawa Kansai from late, I should say, 18th century and early 19th century. By the way, these religious texts also contributed quite a lot, I should say, especially in the case of Buddhist religious texts. People would add or change the characters in order to help and aid with the reading of these rather complicated, rather kanji-heavy texts. So katakana developed predominantly from these religious texts. If it wasn't for the overly complex nature of these texts, then katakana wouldn't have been born as a reading aid and ultimately as part of the Japanese written language later on. In any case, there are several arguments for standardization that were circulated in the late 1800s as Japan became a modern nation, or started to modernize, at least embarked on this project of modernization. The first argument for standardization was people don't have the time or resources to commit to the learning and study of various different written texts. People shouldn't be expected to be able to read the Chinese classics in their original form. They shouldn't be expected to read religious texts in their original form. They should have, or there should be, one form that allows everyone to access the same knowledge on an equal and level playing field. Argument two was a unified language would result in more efficient communication between people. If we have several different types of written language, then it becomes much harder to actually understand what other groups within society are trying to say. So a unified language would eliminate those issues. The third argument was that literacy would be much easier to achieve if written language was simplified and standardized and taught across Japan in its new school system. So the education system was also being built at this time as well, you see. So there was a strong tie and a strong incentive to actually standardize Japanese so that everyone within Japanese society could learn the same written form of Japanese. Argument four was that different ideas and discoveries, scientific, academic, both domestic and of course foreign, will spread much quicker. People will be able to absorb new knowledge much quicker if there's a common mode of writing in use between individuals within society. So in order for members of society to actually share ideas, there has to be this unification and this standardization of written language. This is what led to the start of the Genbun Ichi movement, which started in the late 1800s and involved many different thinkers, linguists and philosophers in Japan. It included people such as Nishi Amane, who's pictured here on this slide. We can put him on a stamp. We have Otsuki Fumihiko, who was one of the most famous lexicographers in Japan in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He wrote the very first modern dictionary of Japanese. And then, of course, we have Basil Hall Chamberlain, who is well known as an educator. He worked at Tokyo University, but also was very active in terms of research and the sort of discussions that he was engaged in surrounding the Japanese language. These individuals, this movement, argued for the unification of written and spoken Japanese. Basically, what they argued for was a standard form of written Japanese that would follow, in a sense, a standard dialect. So here we're not just talking about written Japanese and simplifying the written form of the language, but also making sure that that simplified written form, standard written form, is very similar or can be approximated to spoken Japanese. So people wanted to make sure that they could easily communicate their ideas and if you have a standard language that is written and spoken in almost exactly the same way, such as with English or Korean, even better, that's a much better example, then you are more able to share ideas efficiently. So the Genbo Nichi movement also argued for the removal of kanji characters and replacing the current writing system at the time, which was usually a mixture of kanji and hiragana, sometimes katakana, or in some cases it was just kanji and nothing else, as we saw with some of the texts that the elite of Japanese society were composing, or the religious texts that the Buddhist monks, priests were using. Getting rid of kanji and making language much more accessible was also an aim of the Genbo Nichi movement. Of course, with the modernization of Japanese society and the spread of Japanese language, in which it was taught in schools, for instance, led to many people actually debating what the Japanese language should look like as a language of Japanese society, as a language of the nation. So by the early 1900s, we see these sort of regional alliances within Japan, disappearing. And instead of these regional alliances, we see a sense of national solidarity, a sense of belonging to the nation of Japan, and of course, the myths that are associated with nationhood, the myth of monolingualism, for instance, that people from the nation of Japan spoke or should speak Japanese. This myth was cultivated, and scholars began to debate the structure of the Japanese language along these lines as well. How should we view Japanese? What are its origins, its grammatical features? How does it differ, in other words, from other languages? What makes it stand out? And around this time, we see the word national language and language problems spread rapidly. National language, of course, in Japanese is kokugo, and kokugo just means the language of a country, a national language. And language problems also, by the way, includes the word kokugo, which means national language problems. So people began to study these problems. Linguists began to dedicate their time to research and sort of exploring and investigating national language related issues. Of course, this meant that patriotism became much more popular within sort of newly modernizing Japanese nation state. And of course, Japan also began expanding as an empire of sorts. It's first annexed Okinawa in the 1870s and then moved up to Hokkaido later on. Now, in order to make sure that these annexed territories were part of the Japanese nation and the Japanese empire as well, by extension, classrooms within these annexed territories needed to also teach a standard form of Japanese. This meant actively discouraging the use of Hogen or dialects within the classroom. There are famous examples of classroom teachers in Okinawa punishing students for using their own Okinawan dialect, or what could be even perceived as their own language, their mother tongue. This was strongly discouraged within the classroom, and students were punished by being asked to wear what was called Hogen Fudan, which is sort of like a tag that one would hang around one's neck with a wooden block hanging off the tag. It's a little bit like a necklace. And the word Hogen, Kinshi, or something along those lines, no use, punished for using dialect, or no dialects in the classroom, was inscribed on such tags. Of course, there were many developments that were occurring around this time, the turn of the century, the war against Russia, and other events ignited patriotic sentiments, and so people began looking inwards and celebrating the Japanese nation. And one way of celebrating this sort of newly found sense of nationalism was through a celebration of the Japanese language. Ueda Kazutoshi is a famous linguist who really promoted the study of Japanese as a national language. He wrote a book that argued for the study of Japanese and argued for the framing of Japanese as a national language in its own right. His work was really influential and went on to affect the work of many generations of linguists within Japan. This is a picture of Ueda taken in the mid-1930s. So, teaching individuals, young minds, the Japanese language was really part and parcel of sculpting individuals and shaping individuals who could really view themselves as part of the Japanese nation. If they could speak Japanese, sound like they were Japanese, then they were, their teachers told them at least, part of the Japanese nation, part of the Japanese empire. And of course, within the classroom, standard Japanese, or hyojungo, was taught to students from a very young age. And this happened in Okinawa, Hokkaido, but also on mainland Japan. And thanks to the spread of compulsory education, access to education improved. By law, students or children were required to study at school. And this was a wonderful opportunity for the government and for others, also other actors within Japanese society, to inculcate this sense of nationalism and this sense of national identity within their students through the study of Japanese, standard Japanese, as a national language. I'm not arguing here that compulsory education or access to free education is a bad thing, but there are different ways of actually fostering a sense of identity that might move beyond this idea of linking or equating a language with the idea of a nation. In any case, people began to ask questions like, what is Japanese anyway? What counts as Japanese? And we have linguists and scholars and elites all sort of weighing in on this debate. And what happened was that the majority viewed the Tokyo dialect as the main dialect that should be the model for standard spoken Japanese, or hyojungo. And that is indeed what happened. The Tokyo dialect became sort of the mold in which many educators and linguists fit their sort of idea of Japanese as a national language into. It's the center, the seat of power at the time, as Japan began to modernize. Its capital moved to Tokyo, and it was much easier to use that since the other seats of power, the government, ministries, etc., the elites were all located there. But what would count as written Japanese? That was another question that was still being debated. And this required some intervention from linguists and policymakers. The government decided to support a language policy group, and the first language policy group was established in 1901. And it was headed by none other than Ueda Kazutoshi, the person who was, of course, a nationalist and in favor of this idea of Japanese being taught and spread, I guess, as a national language within Japanese society, and I guess the Japanese empire too. So policy making was necessary at this time because although a group of linguists could come together and form an academic society or association and sort of promote the use of a particular form of the written language, their judgment didn't carry as much weight. And of course, in many senses, even if it did, it would be very difficult to implement their suggestions without the support of the government. Ministry of Education, for instance. So it was, I guess, at the time, viewed as important to have a policy-making body. And we see throughout the 20th century, throughout the 1900s, different language policy bodies and groups forming with the support of the government in order to create new suggestions and policy measures that could be implemented across Japanese society. Now, in Imperial Japan, it was actually quite difficult to make major changes to the Japanese language in its written form. The removal of kanji, for instance, especially kanji that was used to describe the imperial household, was nearly impossible because of this idea of the sanctity and inviolability of the imperial household and the Japanese emperor. So removing those kanji sort of from use in written Japanese was a big no-no. And a variety, however, of language policies were mobilized throughout the Japanese Empire, including most notably in Korea, where various linguists argued for language planning within families. Very famous linguist who's taught at Keijo Daigaku, which is Seoul National University today. It used to be known as Keijo. Tokieda Motoki, so a famous linguist by the name of Tokieda, argued that mothers, Korean mothers, should be taught the Japanese language, standard Japanese, so that they could pass the standard Japanese language onto their children within the household, and ask them to turn that language into a mother tongue for the younger generations of Koreans living within the Japanese Empire. This was a suggestion that was made in the late 30s, early 1940s. And the reasoning or the rationale behind this was that if you could remove Korean and introduce Japanese as a mother tongue or a home language within Korean society, then that would help with assimilation. It would help make citizens, imperial citizens out of Korean foreigners. So here are some examples of wartime and post-war policy making that I also wanted to touch on. So attempts at simplification, of course, occurred between the 1930s and 1950s by a variety of different policymakers. Then there was the language planning efforts of linguists and others in Korea, for instance, but also in places like Taiwan. And then in the post-war period, we see some progressive reform actually taking place with the Toyo Kanji-hyo introduced. And this meant that written Japanese got rid of many of its unused and sort of overly complicated kanji. Kanji set list was reduced to a relatively manageable number. And the agreement at the time, the consensus amongst policymakers, was that we would eventually get rid of all of the kanji and replace the Japanese written language with a sort of single script, phonetic writing system. In 1980, though, people, I guess policymakers kind of took a step back and said, we'll keep the number of kanji at a minimum, but we're not going to remove any more. And that's the main sort of emphasis in the Joyo Kanji-hyo, which is the kanji set list that is in use today. Now, as we all know, during the late 1940s, the Allied forces occupied Japan. But what isn't as well known is that Japan's neighbors were also sort of heavily involved in their own language policy initiatives. Korea and China, for instance, Korea got rid of kanji completely. China was also aiming to do this. The newly founded sort of People's Republic of China, so I don't know why I've written that PCR, it should be PRC, announced progressive language policy, so simplification and Romanization. And this actually influenced language policymakers in Japan. It encouraged them to go even further than their original set list. We see meetings actually taking place between Japanese language policymakers. Right at the top levels, the chair of the national language policy body in Japan met with his counterparts in China at a time when relations still weren't normalized between Japan and China. Now, of course, it's important to sort of look beyond the government and its initiatives and the scholars and linguists it supported. And so I've dedicated this section to a question of who else had power over language in Japanese society. The youth had a lot of power over Japanese in its written form during the 1970s through all the way to the early 2000s. This began with young girls, actually, high school girls, junior high school girls, and university students for the most part, and their use of a playful form of the written Japanese language called marumoji. Later on in the early 2000s, as texting and the use of computers became much more widespread, we see the development of gyarumoji. But let's spend a moment just talking about marumoji. Marumoji was a new way of writing Japanese, a very playful and experimental way that sort of spread amongst girls and women who were aged between 12 and 26 years. And it was connected to the spread of two things, really, amongst the youth in Japan. The spread of cute culture, kawaii culture, and consumerism. And a good embodiment of these two things is the very famous pop musician Matsuda Seiko, who is pictured here. She became what's known as an idol, celebrity of sorts in Japanese societies in the early 1980s. And many high school students looked up to such celebrities, and through them, they were able to develop these new ideas about how to be cute, how to represent cuteness in their daily lives. Now, marumoji was one example of this, writing in a very round and very unique way when compared to other older members of society, sort of singled out and helped these young girls stand out from their peers and others as well, other members, other segments of society. This was viewed negatively, though. So professors who were marking university entrance exams were very frustrated, flustered when they saw this kind of writing in the exams that they were marking and grading. In some cases, they even added notes to entrance examinations with warnings, like students who use marumoji will receive a 0 grade, or please do not use marumoji, make sure that writing is legible. These were ways of trying to sort of stop the youth from sharing and expressing their own identity. And this is an interesting example of how identity could be expressed again, not through a connection between the nation and language, but a connection between peers and a newly emerging cute culture and written language. Now, cute culture continued to have an influence, and in the late 1990s and early 2000s, texting provided young girls with another sort of opportunity to express themselves through written Japanese. there's some really good examples here. Look at the words at the bottom here. I guess over there. Sorry, yoroshiku. That is written in that way. It looks very different to the way in which it would be written if just an average person would write it, whether through texting or by hand. This was a very experimental use of written language, and girls using gyarumoji actually looked for different symbols that were typically represented on the standard keyboard in order to create new ways of writing Japanese. So that's all I wanted to share with you. And really my final remarks are that power is always subjective. And we can see changes and shifts in power all of the time. So although during Japan's period of modernization, the state and linguists and the elites played a big role in determining how people write and how people speak. We also do have instances of the youth creating their own ways of expressing themselves through the written language. And Marumoji and Gyarumoji are just two examples of this. I'm sure that we can find other instances. And of course, we can also look at the revitalization of dialects as an example of how spoken Japanese isn't just a standard form, but it can be regional and it can be just as playful as Marumoji and Gyarumoji as well. We see this, as, of course, on TV shows and mainstream media, Japanese comedy as well. So here are my references. I encourage you to look at some of these references if you'd like to learn a bit more about the questions that I've covered in today's guest lecture. Thank you all for listening.